much. I'm sorry not to be able to be there in person today, but I'm very glad that we've saved the carbon emissions and I'm able to be with you virtually. Just wanted to say, first of all, that I was very interested by Monsieur Lalonde's analysis and agree with a lot of it. I do think that things are moving in particular, but I think there are a lot of difficulties in the way, and one of them, of course, has just happened this morning when Yvo de Bourgh, the Executive Secretary of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, resigned. And I think that the effect of that resignation to date is going to be, well, it's going to be pretty bad news for the process, because, you know, we've heard about what happened at Copenhagen. I'll go into that, my views on that in a bit more detail in a moment. But to lose the captain of the ship at this point in the voyage is obviously not going to be very helpful when it comes to actually getting anywhere this year in the run-up to Mexico. Why has Mr. de Bourgh gone? Well, it's not surprising, really, is it? He's had 4 years of immensely hard work trying to push this rock uphill, and every time he gets there, it just rolls back down again. And there's only a limited amount of time that any one person can stand that. So the search is on now for a successor, and that successor would probably, politically, have to come from a developing country. There aren't any obvious candidates at the moment that most people can think of. Perhaps some of you might have other ideas. If you do, it'd be great to know them. But at this stage in the process, after Copenhagen and on the road to Mexico, this is obviously going to set us back quite a long way. So just to go on to what this means for the UN process, I mean, I think there's a broad agreement coming out of Copenhagen, and Monsieur Lalonde talked about it, that the UN process itself is not working very well. Now, we mustn't exaggerate this. There were some good outcomes from Copenhagen. If you had said going into the summit that what we would come out with was an agreement among developed and developing nations for the first time that would commit them all to lowering the greenhouse gas emissions, that we would also get an agreement on financial flows from the developed to the developing world, and that we would get an agreement on a long-term climate goal, that being in the end 2 degrees. If you had said that going into the conference, I think people would have said, well, that's a pretty good outcome. So, you know, in many ways, that's a good outcome. It gives us a lot to build on. But of course, what overshadowed that outcome were the scenes of absolute chaos at the summit. And it really was chaos. You had people running around who literally had no idea what was going on. You had unscheduled meetings, we're told they were unscheduled, taking place among major players. You had scenes whereby some countries were able to use their time on the world stage purely for political grandstanding purposes. There were some countries who were able to hijack and to wreck the process. And I think no one who was participating in that would want to go through that again. So what can we do to repair this process or to seek a new process? And what can we do in the context of, you know, having one deadline of Mexico at least, and then perhaps further deadlines after that, all the while trying to find someone to head up this process? I think the first thing that we have to recognise is how the positions of some of the key players have changed quite remarkably at Copenhagen and in the run-up to it. and just afterwards. China, I would look at particularly. China played quite a destructive role at Copenhagen, although the Chinese government did come forth with a target on emissions reduction. Still, it was some of China's friends, countries like the Sudan, countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, that proved to be the most disruptive at the conference and who effectively blocked the Copenhagen Accord from being formally adopted. It would be naive not to see that China had some influence over these countries. And indeed, China's words immediately after the Copenhagen Accord had been signed were very telling. The Copenhagen Accord had actually been signed. China had agreed to it. And then one of China's senior negotiators stood up on the conference floor and said that it was basically meaningless. That was not very helpful and rather an extraordinary thing for China to do. Subsequently, shortly after that, we heard from some other very senior Chinese officials that climate change was not happening because of human activity, casting doubt on climate change science. Again, coming from senior members of the Chinese government, that's distinctly unhelpful. So China's role, I think, although China was being praised in the run-up to Copenhagen for having taken on targets and agreeing to negotiate and so on, I think China's role was rather more negative in the end than that suggested. The other thing that's changed remarkably, of course, is the US, and we need the US to lead on this. There's no question about that. The US is no longer the world's biggest emitter, but it is still the biggest economy, even in recession. And really, unless the US picks up this baton, there really is very little hope of actually getting any meaningful action on climate change. And the bad news there, of course, is that the failures Mr. Obama has had on healthcare, the defeat in Massachusetts, the ongoing difficulties he's having with Congress, all bode very, very ill for climate change legislation. And people in the US are now saying there's very little chance of any legislation worth the name. There may be some kind of energy bill, but it won't produce cap and trade. So where does that leave the US in the context of these negotiations? Another thing that's changed, of course, is that since Copenhagen, the science of climate change has come under the most sustained attack that I've seen certainly in the last 5 years. We're all familiar with climate change skeptics, of course, they've always been around, but the attacks on the IPCC in the past few weeks, the revelations of the emails from just before Copenhagen, but of course that has gone rumbling on, they've been very damaging, very, very damaging. And they have given people the impression that climate change is not something to worry about, that either the climate change science is actually shaky in some way, or that climate change is a matter of politics, that it's not for scientists to tell us what's happening, that actually you should go with your political opinion on this. Or indeed, almost that climate change is a belief system. I had a scientist the other day saying, people are always asking me if I believe in climate change. And you find this quite shocking as a scientist, that people should regard this as a matter of belief. And if we get into climate change being a matter of belief, then we will end up, somewhere where the creationism, versus evolution argument is in the United States. And I don't think any of us wants that to happen. So at the same time as trying to pick up the threads of Copenhagen, at the same time as the US being unable really to take a lead, at the same time as China really taking a much harder line on these issues than they have for a few years, at the same time as all that, we're having to defend the basic science. So things are not good. The other thing that I would say just about Copenhagen that I found shocking being there was the extraordinarily destructive and pernicious role that was played by a number of the NGOs at Copenhagen, by some of the green campaigning groups, the groups that are out there claiming to save the planet. I'm afraid at Copenhagen they were doing nothing of the kind, because what they did was to foster divisions among developing countries, between developing and developed countries. They helped some countries to reopen arguments that should have been settled long before Copenhagen, such as 1.5 versus 2 degrees and so on. Why was that being brought up in the final days of the negotiations? Why had it not been brought up at a much earlier stage? That should have been settled at Bali, 2 years before, and it was being reopened. They assisted in this demonization of developed countries, which really doesn't help anyone. Yes, developed countries must do more. Yes, their current targets are not adequate to get us to where we need to be in terms of the science. But according to some analyses, the targets are not too far off, and we should give credit to developed countries where that credit is due, because the problem is that if countries don't get credit for what they're doing, then they'll think there's no point, So this constantly destructive attitude, this constantly negative attitude from NGOs does not help in that respect. The way they foster divisions among developing countries and between developing and developed countries also is not helpful, where they reopened old arguments, and these sterile arguments over, what should happen to the Kyoto Protocol. When we were all there in Copenhagen to try and find what will be a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, to get hung up in arguments about a second commitment period is really not actually helpful. The NGOs, I'm afraid, were guilty of making the perfect agreement the enemy of the good. They were guilty of letting their ideological considerations get in the way. They were guilty of not turning their critical faculties onto countries such as China, which is the world's biggest emitter. So, really, I think the NGOs could have paid a bit more attention to trying to get China to do more, as they were doing to the developed countries. And really, I think if the NGOs are to play a useful role in these negotiations in the future, then they should grow up. So those are my messages from Copenhagen and from what's happened today, and very happy to take questions. Thank you.